You're browsing a weekend antique market, the kind where folding tables stretch out under canvas awnings, and everything smells faintly of dust and old wood. You pause at one stall, drawn to a small velvet tray of trinkets. A brass compass, a tarnished locket, a ring set with a dark green stone. The vendor catches your eye and smiles. "Everything here has a story," she says, and you believe her. Not because of anything she said, but because something about these objects feels heavier than it should. Like they remember every hand that held them. Like they're still keeping track. Welcome back to Midnight Deep Dive. Or if you're new here, welcome to our cozy corner of the internet where we explore the strange, the mysterious, and the genuinely fascinating. Tonight, we're venturing into a topic that sits right at the crossroads of history, folklore, and human psychology. The world of cursed artifacts. We're talking about objects that have allegedly brought misfortune, tragedy, and outright terror to everyone unfortunate enough to own them. Diamonds that shattered dynasties, dolls that moved on their own, paintings that survived fires that destroyed everything around them. So settle in, find your most comfortable position, and let yourself drift as we journey through 10 of the most haunted artifacts and objects in the world. There are objects in the world that feel ordinary the moment you hold them. A smooth river stone, a brass button, a chipped coffee mug, and then there are objects that seem to carry weight far beyond their physical size. The Hope Diamond is one of those objects. At just over 45 carats, it could sit in the palm of your hand. But for more than 3 centuries, it has left a trail of misfortune so consistent, so seemingly deliberate, that even hardened skeptics find it difficult to wave away as coincidence. The story of the Hope Diamond begins in the Golconda mines of India, in the region of what is now Andhra Pradesh. For centuries, this area was the only source of diamonds in the world, and the stones that emerged from its depths were treated as sacred objects, believed to carry the power of the gods themselves. The largest and most spectacular gems were considered too dangerous for ordinary hands. They belonged to kings, to temples, to the divine order of things. The diamond that would eventually become the Hope Diamond was first recorded in the early 17th century, when a French traveler named Jean Tavernier purchased it from an Indian dealer. At that point, the stone was an enormous, roughly cut blue gem weighing around 112 carats. Tavernier brought it back to France, where he sold it to King Louis XIV in 1669. The king commissioned it to be cut down, and the result was a stunning, deep blue stone of about 68 carats. Now, the misfortune didn't begin immediately. Louis XIV wore the diamond and lived a long, relatively successful life. But the stone's darker reputation started building in the generation that followed. Louis XIV's great-grandson, Louis XV, inherited the gem, and during his reign, the stone passed through several hands, each of whom met with some form of tragedy. The details get muddled in the retelling, as they often do with stories this old, but the pattern that emerged was striking enough that by the time the diamond reached revolutionary France, it already had a reputation. The Hope Diamond's most infamous chapter is connected to Marie Antoinette, though the connection is more complicated than popular stories suggest. The diamond was part of the French crown jewels when the revolution swept through Paris in 1789. Marie Antoinette herself didn't wear it regularly, but the stone was intimately bound up with the monarchy she represented. When the crown jewels were seized during the revolution, the diamond was among them, and its association with royal excess became part of the broader narrative of aristocratic excess that fueled revolutionary fury. Marie Antoinette, of course, was executed by guillotine in 1793. After the revolution, the diamond was cut down again, reducing it to roughly its current size of 45.52 carats. It passed through a series of owners over the following decades, and here is where the curse narrative really begins to take shape. A Dutch banker named Willem Fowles reportedly acquired the stone and later went blind. His son, who inherited it, died by ending his own life. The stone then passed to a London jeweler named Henry Philip Hope in the 1830s, and it was Hope who gave the diamond its current name. Hope himself lived a comfortable, prosperous life, which somewhat undermines the curse theory. But the diamond's reputation grew through his descendants. His great-grandson, Henry Winston Hope, inherited the stone and reportedly suffered a series of personal and financial misfortunes. The gem passed through several more hands, each time accompanied by whispered stories of tragedy, financial ruin, or worse. The most dramatic chapter in the curse narrative involves a young woman named Evelyn Walsh McLean, an American socialite who purchased the Hope diamond in 1911. McLean was wealthy, adventurous, and famously dismissive of the curse. She reportedly laughed at the warnings and wore the diamond regularly, treating it as a party piece and a conversation starter. What followed was, by any measure, a devastatingly unlucky series of events. McLean's young son was killed in a car accident. Her daughter died of a drug overdose. Her husband became involved in a scandal and was institutionalized for mental illness. McLean herself struggled with addiction and died in relative obscurity in 1947. Whether these tragedies were caused by the diamond or simply the kind of misfortune that afflicts many wealthy families is impossible to say. But the timing and the sheer concentration of tragedy made the curse story feel undeniable to those who were watching. After McLean's death, the diamond passed through her estate and was eventually purchased by jeweler Harry Winston in 1949. Winston, a shrewd businessman who understood the power of a good story, wore the diamond at parties and exhibitions for years, building its fame. Then in 1958, he did something remarkable. He mailed the Hope diamond to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., wrapped in a simple brown paper package and sent through the United States Post Office. The postage cost was a few dollars. The insurance was $650. Winston donated the diamond to the Smithsonian, where it has sat ever since, behind bulletproof glass in the National Museum of Natural History. Millions of people visit it every year. And the curse. Winston lived until 1974, dying peacefully at the age of 81. The Smithsonian has, to anyone's knowledge, experienced no particular wave of misfortune since acquiring the stone. So what do we make of the Hope diamond's dark reputation? The honest answer is that confirmation bias plays an enormous role in how we interpret its history. When a gem this famous passes through many owners over 3 centuries, some of those owners will inevitably experience tragedy. We remember the tragedies because they fit the story. We forget or ignore the owners who lived perfectly ordinary lives. The diamond doesn't cause misfortune. It simply attracts our attention when misfortune happens to someone connected to it. But there's something else worth considering. The Hope diamond has always been associated with power, wealth, and status. And throughout history, people who possess extraordinary wealth and status have often lived extraordinarily turbulent lives. The pressures of maintaining that position, the politics, the rivalries, the scrutiny, these create conditions where tragedy is genuinely more likely. The curse might not be supernatural at all. It might simply be a reflection of the dangerous world that wealth and fame have always inhabited. In the end, it's a 45-carat piece of blue carbon. Sitting behind bulletproof glass in a museum in Washington, D.C., millions of people pass by it every year without incident. But the story follows it everywhere it goes, and nobody who reads it can quite shake the feeling that beauty, this extraordinary, must come at a price. There's something about dolls that unsettles us in ways that other toys don't. Perhaps it's the human form, the painted or sewn-on eyes that seem to follow you across a room. Perhaps it's the way they sit motionless in corners, patient and waiting. Whatever the reason, dolls have been the subject of supernatural fear for centuries. But of all the dolls that have allegedly crossed the line from toy to haunted object, one stands out above the rest. Not because it's the most physically frightening, It's actually a rather ordinary-looking ragdoll, but because of the sheer volume of reported activity surrounding it, and because of the family who brought it to public attention. Annabelle's story begins in the early 1970s in a modest apartment in Los Angeles. A young nursing student named Donna had received the doll as a birthday gift from her mother. It was a Ragdoll brand doll, the kind you might find in any toy shop of that era, with a round stitched face, button eyes, and yarn hair. Donna kept it in her bedroom, and for a while everything was perfectly normal. The trouble started gradually. Donna began noticing that the doll seemed to have moved between the times she left her room and returned. A hand that had been at its side would be raised. The doll would appear in a different spot on the bed. Small shifts easy to dismiss individually. But over days and weeks, the pattern became harder to ignore. Donna mentioned it to her roommate, a fellow nursing student named Linda, and Linda reported noticing the same thing. Then the notes started appearing. Donna would find small pieces of parchment-like paper with messages written in a child's handwriting. The notes said things like, "Miss Donna, please help us," and "Miss Donna, need help." The handwriting didn't match Donna's or Linda's. The paper itself was unusual. Neither woman had parchment in the apartment, and they couldn't find a source for it anywhere in the building. Donna, unsettled but curious rather than terrified, consulted a psychic medium. The medium told her that the doll was inhabited by the spirit of a young girl named Annabelle Higgins, who had lived on the property decades earlier and died there at the age of 7. The spirit, the medium explained, was drawn to Donna and wanted to be close to her. She wasn't malevolent, just lonely. This explanation was, in a way, reassuring. A lonely child's spirit seeking companionship didn't sound threatening. Donna felt sympathy for the situation and allowed the doll to stay. But the activity escalated. One evening, Donna's boyfriend Greg visited the apartment. He later reported feeling an intense, inexplicable anger when he looked at the doll, an emotion that seemed to come from nowhere and had no connection to anything in his life. That same evening, Greg woke in the middle of the night to find scratches across his chest, 3 parallel lines that he was certain hadn't been there when he went to sleep. It was at this point that Donna and Linda reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, the married couple who had built a career investigating paranormal phenomena. The Warrens were already well known in paranormal circles, having investigated numerous supposedly haunted locations, and they agreed to look at the situation. Ed Warren, who described himself as a demonologist, examined the doll and reportedly felt an immediate sense of unease. He told Donna and Linda that the doll was not possessed by a child's spirit. The psychic medium's reading had been wrong or deliberately misleading. What was attached to the doll, Ed said, was something far older and far more dangerous. He advised Donna to stop interacting with it entirely and to have it blessed by a Catholic priest. A priest did come and bless the doll, and for a short time the activity seemed to stop. But it didn't stay quiet for long. The Warrens eventually took the doll from Donna and Linda and brought it back to their home in Monroe, Connecticut, where they kept it in a dedicated room in their house, which they called the Warren Occult Museum. The room where Annabelle has been kept ever since is reportedly one of the most active in the Warren collection. Visitors have reported feeling watched, experiencing sudden drops in temperature, and in a few cases, claiming to have been physically pushed or scratched after entering. The Warrens kept a sign on the door warning visitors not to touch the doll and not to mock it. Some accounts suggest that people who ignored the warning and taunted the doll were followed by misfortune afterward. Now, it's important to step back and consider what we actually know here, as opposed to what has been claimed. The Annabelle story was popularized through the Warrens' books and lectures, and later through the enormously successful horror film franchise that began in 2014. The films are fictional, obviously, but they were built on the foundation of the Warrens' claims, which were themselves never independently verified. Ed Warren passed away in 2006, and Lorraine followed in 2019. The museum and its contents, including Annabelle, have been maintained by the Warren family. The doll itself is an ordinary manufactured ragdoll. There is no independent evidence that it has ever moved on its own, produced writing, or scratched anyone. The scratches on Greg, the moving doll, the mysterious notes. These are all based on the testimony of people connected to the Warrens, reported through channels that the Warrens controlled. What makes Annabelle fascinating isn't whether the doll is truly haunted. It almost certainly isn't. What's interesting is what the story reveals about how cursed object myths are created and maintained in the modern era. The Warrens were skilled storytellers with a platform and an audience eager to believe. The story has all the elements that make a good haunting narrative. An ordinary object, escalating activity, a vulnerable protagonist, and a dramatic resolution. It's a story that was crafted as much as it was reported, shaped by the needs of the people telling it. And it worked. The film franchise has earned hundreds of millions of dollars. People visit the Warren Museum specifically to see the doll. The curse may be fictional, but Annabelle has become a cultural icon, a symbol of childhood dread and the unsettling idea that the things we surround ourselves with might not be as innocent as they appear. On November 4, 1922, in a valley in the Egyptian desert where pharaohs had been buried for centuries, a team of archaeologists led by Howard Carter made a discovery that would captivate the entire world. After years of searching, Carter found the entrance to an almost completely intact tomb, one of the only royal tombs in Egypt's Valley of the Kings that had not been thoroughly looted by grave robbers thousands of years earlier. The tomb belonged to Tutankhamun, a young pharaoh who had died over 3,200 years ago, and who had been, until that moment, almost entirely forgotten by history. The discovery was extraordinary on its own merits. The tomb contained over 5,000 artifacts, including golden furniture, ceremonial weapons, stunning jewelry, and the famous golden death mask that has become one of the most recognizable images in all of archaeology. It was a window into ancient Egyptian royal life that no other discovery could match. Carter and his sponsor, Lord Carnarvon, an English aristocrat who had funded the excavation, were celebrated as heroes of archaeology. But within months of the tomb's opening, Lord Carnarvon was dead. And with his death, one of history's most enduring curses was born. Carnarvon developed an infection after cutting himself while shaving, and the wound became septic. He developed pneumonia as a complication and died in Cairo on April 5, 1923, at the age of 57. The cause of death was entirely ordinary, a bacterial infection that could have happened to anyone at any time. But the timing was striking. The tomb had been opened just months earlier, and Carnarvon's death created an immediate narrative opportunity. The British press seized on it. Stories began appearing in newspapers claiming that an ancient curse had been inscribed on the tomb, warning that death would come to any who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. The specific wording of this supposed curse has been reported in dozens of different versions over the years, none of them reliably sourced. Some versions reference hieroglyphic inscriptions found near the tomb's entrance. Others claim the curse was written in ink on a piece of pottery. The actual archaeological record is frustratingly unclear on whether any such inscription ever existed in the form the newspapers described. What did exist was a genuine tradition in ancient Egyptian burial practices of placing protective spells and warnings near tombs. These weren't curses in the way we understand the word. They were invocations meant to protect the deceased's spirit and possessions from disturbance. They were directed at the gods, not at future tomb robbers, and they certainly weren't written with the expectation that Europeans with flashlights would be reading them 3 millennia later. But the press didn't need accuracy. They needed a story, and the mummy's curse gave them one of the best stories of the 20th century. The deaths that followed Lord Carnarvon's were catalogued with obsessive detail by newspapers and later by writers eager to perpetuate the legend. Over the following years and decades, various people connected to the tomb's discovery or its contents died, and each death was added to the curse's body count. Some of these deaths were genuinely tragic and relatively soon after the tomb's opening. Others occurred years or even decades later to people with only the loosest connection to the excavation. A few were outright fabrications, deaths attributed to people who actually lived for many more years. Howard Carter himself, the man most directly responsible for opening the tomb, lived until 1939, dying at the age of 64 of entirely natural causes. He spent the years after the discovery cataloging and studying the tomb's contents, working in Egypt without apparent supernatural consequence for the better part of 2 decades. If there was a curse protecting Tutankhamun's rest, Carter seems to have been remarkably exempt from it. So why did the mummy's curse become such a powerful and enduring myth? Several factors converged at exactly the right moment. The 1920s were a period of intense public fascination with the exotic and the supernatural. Spiritualism, seances, and belief in the paranormal were fashionable in post-World War I Britain and America. As people grappled with the enormous losses of the war and sought comfort in the idea that death wasn't final, a curse emanating from ancient Egypt fit perfectly into this cultural appetite. The press also played a significant role. Lord Carnarvon had sold exclusive reporting rights on the tomb's discovery to the Times of London, which meant other newspapers were locked out of the biggest archaeological story of the decade. Frustrated competitors had every incentive to find alternative angles, and the curse provided exactly that. It was dramatic, it was supernatural, and it couldn't be disproven quickly enough to kill the story before it sold papers. There's also something deeply human about the curse narrative that makes it stick. We are uncomfortable with the idea of disturbing the dead. Across nearly every culture on Earth, there are taboos around graves, burial sites, and the remains of the deceased. The idea that ancient Egypt might have placed some kind of protection around its kings, and that violating that protection might have consequences, resonates with instincts far older than any newspaper headline. Modern scholarship has done a great deal to deflate the curse myth. Epidemiologists and historians have examined the death records of everyone connected to the excavation and found that the mortality rates were entirely consistent with what you would expect from a group of men of their ages and social circumstances living in the early 20th century. Some died young, some lived long lives. The deaths that seemed dramatic were dramatic because we were paying attention to them, not because they were statistically unusual. The tomb itself, when examined by archaeologists, contained no curse inscription in the sensational form the newspapers described. There were protective spells, as was standard in Egyptian burial practice, but nothing that read like a threat to future visitors. The curse was in large part a creation of the British press and the cultural moment in which the discovery was made. There's something almost fitting about that. Tutankhamun was largely forgotten for 3,000 years. And then, in the space of a few months in 1922, he became immortal again, not through the resurrection his tomb spells had promised, but through a curse story that the modern world invented and refused to let go of. The Pharaoh didn't need magic to live forever. He just needed the right story at the right time. Picture a painting hanging on the wall of your living room. It's not a particularly large piece, not especially valuable by the standards of fine art. It shows a young boy, dark-haired and solemn, with tears streaming down his face. The expression on the child's face is one of quiet sadness, the kind that makes you feel something without quite being able to name it. Now imagine that your house catches fire. Everything burns. The furniture, the photographs, the things that made your house yours. Everything except the painting. It sits in the ashes, untouched, not a scorch mark on its surface, staring up at the sky with those same sad eyes. That is exactly what happened, again and again, to owners of a painting known simply as the Crying Boy. And it happened so many times to so many different people that by the mid-1980s, the painting had become one of the most feared objects in Britain. People who owned copies of it began throwing them away, convinced that the painting was not just surviving fires, but somehow causing them. The painting itself is relatively unremarkable from an art historical perspective. It depicts a young boy with dark hair and large, expressive eyes, tears visible on his cheeks. The style suggests a mid-20th century work, painted in a somewhat sentimental manner that was popular in the 1950s and 60s. Prints and reproductions of the painting were sold widely and cheaply throughout Britain during that era, appearing in homes across the country. It was exactly the kind of art that ordinary families bought to decorate their walls. The curse narrative began gaining momentum in the early 1980s, when a series of house fires in the north of England were reported alongside the discovery that a print of the crying boy had survived each fire undamaged. The fires themselves were not unusual. House fires happen with depressing regularity, and the causes ranged from electrical faults to cooking accidents to cigarettes. But the survival of the painting in each case was striking enough to catch the attention of local newspapers. The story spread quickly. Other families who owned prints of the crying boy began coming forward with their own accounts. Some reported that the painting had survived fires in their homes. Others, more troublingly, reported that fires had started shortly after they acquired the painting. The narrative took on a life of its own, growing with each retelling, and by 1985 it had become a genuine phenomenon of public anxiety. The paranormal explanations varied. Some suggested that the painting carried a genuine supernatural curse, perhaps originating with the artist who created it. Stories emerged about the model for the painting, a young boy who had allegedly suffered terrible misfortune after sitting for the portrait. Other versions claim the artist himself had died tragically. These origin stories shifted and changed with each telling, as origin stories tend to do, and it became difficult to separate any genuine biographical detail from the accumulated layers of folklore. One particularly persistent version of the story involves an artist named Otis Redding, who supposedly painted the original while living in Spain. According to this account, Redding's young son died in a fire, and the painting somehow absorbed the tragedy of that event, carrying it forward into every home where it appeared. Other versions name different artists and different tragic backstories, but the essential structure is the same. Someone connected to the painting suffered, and that suffering became embedded in the object itself. The practical question, of course, is why the painting survived fires when everything else burned. And here the explanation is considerably less supernatural than the stories suggest. Prints and reproductions of popular paintings were typically produced on heavy cardstock or thick paper, and they were often sealed with a protective coating or varnish. These materials, while combustible, have a higher ignition point than the furnishings and fabrics that make up the bulk of a house fire's fuel. In a fire that burns hot and fast, consuming curtains, upholstery, and wooden furniture, a sealed print on thick card might simply take longer to ignite than everything around it. Additionally, the way prints were typically hung in homes of that era matters. Many were hung on walls in frames backed with brown paper or cardboard, and in some cases they were placed in rooms or positions where airflow during a fire might have been limited. A painting in a hallway or on a wall sheltered from the main direction of the fire's spread could plausibly survive while the rest of the room was destroyed. It's not glamorous, but it's physics. The real story of the crying boy isn't really about fire at all. It's about how quickly a pattern can form in public consciousness, and how confirmation bias turns coincidence into conviction. Once the first few stories of fire survival were reported, every family in Britain that owned a print of the crying boy began paying close attention to whether anything unusual happened in their home. If a fire occurred and the painting survived, that confirmed the curse. If no fire occurred, well, the curse hadn't activated yet, And if a fire occurred and the painting burned, that story simply never got told because it didn't fit the narrative. In 1986, the South Yorkshire Fire Brigade, responding to the wave of public anxiety, conducted a controlled test. They attempted to burn a copy of The Crying Boy in a controlled environment. The painting burned normally, just as any other piece of paper or card would. The curse, at least in its literal sense, was not confirmed by the experiment. And yet the story endures. The Crying Boy remains one of the most well-known cursed objects in British popular culture, referenced in television shows, discussed in online forums, and occasionally appearing on auction sites where sellers include disclaimers about its reputation. The painting itself is just ink on paper, but the story wrapped around it is something else entirely. A reminder of how powerfully our expectations shape what we see, and how a tragedy, even an imagined one, can cling to an object long after any rational explanation has been offered. Some cursed objects become famous because of dramatic, high-profile tragedy. Others gain their reputation more quietly, through a steady accumulation of misfortune that builds over years until the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The Basano vase falls into the second category. It isn't particularly beautiful or historically significant. It isn't connected to royalty or fame. It's a simple carved wooden vase, allegedly dating to the 15th century from the town of Basano d'Ivrea in northern Italy. And according to the people who have owned it, it kills anyone who keeps it in their home. The legend of the Basano vase begins with a story that, like many curse origin myths, is difficult to verify historically, but has become deeply embedded in the object's reputation. The tale holds that the vase was carved by a young woman in the town of Basano, sometime in the mid-1400s. She was engaged to be married, and she carved the vase as a gift for her intended husband. But before the wedding could take place, the young man was murdered. The woman, devastated by grief, was found dead shortly after, and the vase was discovered near her body. Whether this story is historically accurate or a later invention designed to explain the vase's reputation is impossible to determine at this point. What is documented, or at least reported, is what happened to the vase in the 20th century, when it resurfaced and began passing through a series of owners with unfortunate results. The vase reportedly entered the possession of a family in northern Italy sometime in the early 1900s. The details of its passage through various hands during this period are murky, but by the mid-20th century, it had acquired enough of a reputation that antique dealers and collectors treated it with genuine caution. The specific accounts that gave the vase its fearsome name involve a series of deaths among its owners over a period of roughly 2 decades. A young bride who received the vase as a wedding gift died within a few months of the wedding. A professor who purchased it for his study died of a heart attack shortly after bringing it home. A merchant who bought it as a conversation piece was found dead in his shop. The deaths varied in cause: heart attacks, car accidents, illness, but they occurred with enough regularity and closely enough to the acquisition of the vase that the pattern became difficult to dismiss as pure coincidence. By the 1960s, the vase had acquired such a dark reputation in Italy that it became essentially unsellable through normal channels. Antique dealers refused to handle it. The few collectors brave or curious enough to acquire it did so with full knowledge of the risk they were supposedly taking, and some of them paid the price, at least according to the accounts that followed. The story that cemented the Basano vase's reputation involved a series of attempts to dispose of it. One owner, reportedly terrified after a family member fell ill shortly after the vase entered the home, attempted to sell it. No one would buy it. They tried to give it away. No one would accept it. Eventually, they wrapped it carefully and mailed it to a local museum, hoping the institution would take it off their hands. The museum declined to accept it, reportedly citing the vase's reputation and their unwillingness to be responsible for whatever might follow. The vase was then reportedly purchased, with considerable reluctance, by a local antique dealer who intended to store it away from customers. He died within a year. The vase passed to his estate, where it caused enough anxiety among his employees that it was eventually wrapped in newspaper and placed in a storage unit. It has not been publicly displayed or sold since, and its current location is a matter of some debate among people who follow these stories. Unlike the Hope Diamond or Annabelle, there is no centuries-long paper trail here, no famous institution lending credibility to the story. It's a carved wooden object with a series of unverified death accounts attached to it. The deaths may have occurred, but connecting them to ownership of a specific vase requires a leap of faith that evidence alone cannot support. And yet the vase's reputation persists, particularly in Italy, where it remains a cautionary tale passed down through communities in the Basano region. It's a warning about hubris, about the dangers of possessing things that don't belong to you, about the way grief can attach itself to objects and follow them through time. Whether the curse is real or the story is what matters, the Basano vase has become one of Europe's quietest and most persistent haunted objects. A small carved wooden cup that allegedly holds more danger than diamonds or golden masks. There's a sapphire sitting in a museum in London that, according to the people who have been connected to it, desperately wants to be somewhere else. Not just somewhere else in the building or somewhere else in England. It wants to go back to India, where it came from. And it has allegedly made life extraordinarily difficult for every person who has stood between it and that goal. The Delhi purple sapphire is one of the strangest cursed object stories in the world, not because of how dramatic the misfortune is, but because of how specific the curse appears to be. This isn't a gem that brings generic bad luck. It brings bad luck that seems almost pointed, almost purposeful, as if the stone itself is running a campaign to get home. The sapphire story begins during the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The event the British called the Indian Mutiny, and Indians now remember as a pivotal moment in the struggle for independence. During the chaos and violence that accompanied the rebellion, British soldiers looted temples, homes, and royal treasuries across northern India. Among the objects taken was a purple-hued sapphire, reportedly stolen from the Temple of Indra, the Hindu god of storms and war, in the city of Kanpur. The stone was brought back to England by a British colonel, and it was at this point that the trouble allegedly began. The colonel's family suffered a series of misfortunes in the years following his return. The accounts vary in their specifics, but the general pattern involved financial difficulties, illness, and a pervasive sense of something being deeply wrong. The colonel himself reportedly became convinced that the stone was the source of his family's problems, though whether he connected it specifically to the theft from the temple or simply to some general sense of bad luck is unclear from the surviving accounts. The sapphire changed hands several times over the following decades, and with each change of ownership, new stories of misfortune attached themselves to it. A man who purchased it as a gift for his wife reportedly watched his marriage collapse within months. A woman who inherited it from a relative experienced a series of accidents and health problems that she attributed to the stone's presence in her home. Each account added another layer to the sapphire's reputation, and by the early 20th century, it had become genuinely feared among the small circles of collectors and antiquarians who dealt in objects with reputations. The sapphire's most famous chapter involves a man named John Temple, a London collector who acquired the stone in the 1890s. Temple was, by all accounts, a man of some courage and considerable skepticism. He purchased the sapphire with full knowledge of its reputation, reportedly viewing the curse as an entertaining piece of folklore rather than a genuine threat. He kept the stone in his home and wore it on occasion, treating it as proof that the supernatural world was, in his view, nonsense. Temple did not experience immediate misfortune, which he took as confirmation of his skepticism. But over the following years, his life deteriorated in ways that his associates found difficult to ignore. His business ventures failed. His health declined. His family relationships became strained. Temple himself eventually came to believe that the stone was responsible, and he attempted to have it destroyed. When that proved difficult, the sapphire is extraordinarily hard, as all sapphires are. He attempted to have it thrown into the sea. According to the story, the boat on which it was being transported experienced severe storms and was forced to return to port. The sapphire remained in England. Temple eventually bequeathed the stone to the British Museum, with a note expressing his hope that the institution's resources and authority might be sufficient to contain whatever danger the stone carried. The sapphire has been in the museum's collection ever since, displayed quietly among thousands of other gemstones, most of which carry no reputation whatsoever. The British Museum has, to anyone's knowledge, not experienced any particular wave of misfortune since acquiring the sapphire. The institution continues to operate normally, and the stone sits in its case without apparent incident. But the story persists, and the sapphire remains one of the most talked-about objects in the museum's collection, not because of its beauty or rarity, but because of the narrative wrapped around it. Unlike most cursed objects, which bring generic misfortune, the sapphire's curse has a specific goal: return to India. The misfortune isn't random punishment. It's the stone's way of expressing displeasure at being kept where it doesn't belong. And that gives the story a resonance that goes well beyond superstition. India and Britain have a long and complicated history, and the looting of Indian treasures during the colonial period remains a source of tension and ongoing debate. The idea that a stolen sacred object might resist its captivity, might actively work to return home, is a powerful metaphor for the broader question of what happens when cultures take things that don't belong to them. Whether the sapphire is truly cursed or simply a beautiful stone wrapped in a compelling story, it has become one of the most eloquent objects in any museum's collection. Most cursed objects are small enough to hold in your hands: a diamond, a doll, a vase, a sapphire. But what happens when the cursed object is 30 feet tall, painted directly onto the walls of a public building, and created by one of the most famous artists in the history of the world? That is the question posed by the murals of Diego Rivera, the Mexican painter whose massive, sweeping works decorated government buildings, hospitals, and homes across Mexico and the United States. Rivera's art was revolutionary, political, and deeply controversial. And according to a persistent thread of folklore and reported misfortune, some of his most ambitious works carried a darkness that went beyond their subject matter. Diego Rivera was born in 1886 in Guanajuato, Mexico, and from an early age showed extraordinary talent. He became one of the central figures of the Mexican muralist movement, a wave of government-sponsored public art that emerged after the Mexican Revolution of 1910. These murals were meant to educate and inspire a largely illiterate population, telling the story of Mexican history, celebrating indigenous culture, and promoting socialist ideals. Rivera threw himself into the work with extraordinary energy, painting murals that covered entire walls and sometimes entire rooms, filling them with dozens of figures, intricate detail, and vivid color. Rivera was also, by all accounts, a deeply eccentric and somewhat dangerous man. He was enormous physically, reportedly weighing over 300 pounds, and he was known for his volatile temperament, his numerous affairs, and his willingness to provoke confrontation. He carried a pistol and was involved in several shooting incidents during his lifetime. His personal life was marked by tragedy, passion, and instability in roughly equal measure. He married the painter Frida Kahlo twice, and their relationship was legendarily turbulent. The curse stories attached to Rivera's murals center primarily on a handful of specific works, each of which has its own trail of misfortune among the people connected to its creation or subsequent history. The most famous involves a mural Rivera painted in 1933 for Rockefeller Center in New York City, a work commissioned by John D. Rockefeller, Jr., as part of an ambitious public art project intended to beautify the city's most prestigious commercial complex. The mural was called Man at the Crossroads, and Rivera conceived it as a sweeping vision of human history, showing the forces of capitalism and communism, science and religion, hope and fear, all swirling around a central figure meant to represent humanity's choice about its future direction. The work was enormous, covering an entire wall of the lobby of 30 Rockefeller Plaza, and Rivera worked on it for weeks, drawing crowds of spectators who watched the famous painter at work. The controversy began when Rivera included a portrait of Vladimir Lenin in the mural, placing the Soviet leader prominently among the figures representing the communist future. Rockefeller, who was no communist sympathizer, demanded that Rivera remove or replace the Lenin figure. Rivera refused. The argument escalated, and eventually Rockefeller ordered Rivera off the scaffold and out of the building. Rivera was paid his fee and escorted from the premises. The mural was left unfinished. Rivera was furious. He created a replica of the mural in Mexico City, completing the work as he had originally envisioned it, Lenin and all. But the original mural at Rockefeller Center was never finished. In 1934, after Rivera had returned to Mexico, Rockefeller ordered the mural destroyed. Workers chipped it off the wall, destroying months of Rivera's work in the process. The destruction of Man at the Crossroads became one of the most famous incidents in the history of public art, a story about the tension between artistic freedom and corporate power. Rivera immortalized the event by painting another mural, Portrait of America, which depicted the destruction of his Rockefeller Center work as an act of cultural suppression. But the curse narrative attached to the original mural focuses less on the political dimensions and more on what happened afterward. Rivera's wife, Frida Kahlo, who had accompanied him to New York during the Rockefeller Center Commission, became seriously ill during the trip and suffered a miscarriage. Rivera himself was plagued by depression and creative paralysis for months after returning to Mexico. The Rockefeller family, meanwhile, experienced a series of personal and professional difficulties over the following decades, though whether these had any connection to the destruction of a mural is, of course, impossible to establish. The curse stories extend to other Rivera murals as well. A series of works he painted in the 1930s and 1940s for various Mexican government buildings became associated with the deaths and misfortunes of laborers and officials connected to their creation. Workers who assisted Rivera on certain projects reported feeling profoundly uneasy, claiming the murals seemed to change as they watched, figures appearing to move or expressions shifting when observed from different angles. Some of these accounts likely reflect the disorienting experience of working close to enormous, detailed paintings for extended periods, where the eye can play tricks. Others may reflect genuine anxiety about working with a man who was known to be volatile and unpredictable. Rivera himself seemed aware of, and somewhat amused by, his reputation as a painter of cursed works. He was not a superstitious man in the traditional sense, but he understood the power of myth and was not above encouraging stories that added to his mystique. It's worth noting, too, how unusual the concept becomes at this scale. A cursed diamond is a discreet, portable thing you can lock in a case. A cursed mural is fixed in place, part of a building, visible to thousands of people. If it carries a curse, does it affect everyone who sees it, or only those directly connected to its creation? Rivera would have enjoyed the question. Whether he deliberately cultivated the curse narrative or simply benefited from it is difficult to say. Rivera died in 1957 at the age of 70 of a relatively rare form of cancer. His body was cremated, and his ashes were mixed with those of Frida Kahlo, who had died 4 years earlier. His murals remain, dozens of them, spread across Mexico and a handful of locations in the United States. They are among the most celebrated works of public art in the world, and they sit on their walls, vast and vivid and impossibly detailed, telling the story of a nation, and a people and a man who painted demons into the fabric of public spaces and dared the world to look away. There is a category of cursed object that differs from diamonds and dolls and sacred tombs in an important way. These aren't objects that were once ordinary and then became haunted through some event. These are objects that were allegedly cursed from the moment of their creation, born out of grief or rage or desperate love, carrying that emotion in their very structure. The Anguille flute is one of the most haunting examples of this kind of object. A simple wooden flute, carved sometime in the 18th century in the Languedoc region of southern France, that according to legend was made by a man who had just lost everything, and that has brought sorrow to every musician who has played it since. The story of the flute's origin varies depending on who is telling it, but the essential shape remains consistent across versions. A young musician in the town of Anguille, in the province of Languedoc, lost his wife and child to illness within the space of a single winter. The man, who had been a talented but unremarkable craftsman of musical instruments, was devastated. He withdrew from the community, stopped working, and spent weeks in a state of profound grief that those who knew him described as almost deathlike in its stillness. When he eventually emerged, he carved a flute, not from the usual materials, not from bone or from seasoned, carefully selected wood. He carved it from the wood of the coffins in which his wife and child had been buried. He dug up the graves at night, retrieved the coffin lids, and shaped them into a single instrument with his own hands. Whether this act was driven by madness, by grief so profound it had become something else entirely, or by a deliberate intention to bind his loss into a physical object that would carry it forward, the accounts don't say. Perhaps he didn't know himself. The flute was beautiful, by all reports. The wood had a deep, warm grain, and the instrument produced a tone that listeners described as unusually affecting, mournful in a way that seemed to go beyond what the notes themselves should have conveyed. People who heard it played felt an inexplicable sadness wash over them, a heaviness that seemed to come from somewhere outside themselves. The musician played the flute for a time and then disappeared. Some versions of the story say he died. Others say he simply walked away and was never seen again. The flute remained, and it passed from hand to hand over the following decades and eventually centuries, each time accompanied by stories of the misfortune that followed its new owner. The pattern of tragedy attached to the Anguille flute is quieter than the sudden deaths associated with something like the Hope diamond or the Basano vase. The flute doesn't kill its owners outright. Instead, it seems to bring a creeping, pervasive sadness into the lives of those who play it. Musicians who acquire the flute report becoming increasingly melancholic. Their relationships deteriorate. Their creative work, while sometimes becoming more emotionally intense, takes on a darkness that alienates audiences and collaborators alike. Some simply stop playing music altogether, unable to bear the weight of what the instrument seems to draw out of them. One of the more detailed accounts involves a French musician in the early 19th century who acquired the flute from an estate sale and incorporated it into his collection of period instruments. He was, by his own account before acquiring the flute, a cheerful and sociable man with a stable marriage and a successful career performing at private gatherings and small concert halls. Within months of bringing the flute home, he found himself unable to stop playing it. He would sit alone in the evening, playing the same simple melodies over and over, and each time he played, the sadness he felt afterward lingered a little longer than the time before. His wife wrote in her diary about the change she observed in him. The man she had married seemed to be retreating behind his eyes, becoming present in body but absent in some deeper way. She asked him to get rid of the flute. He agreed but found himself unable to do so. He tried to sell it. No dealer would accept it, either because of its reputation or because the instrument, despite its unusual tone, was not particularly valuable in practical terms. He tried to give it away. The few musicians who accepted it as a gift returned it within weeks, citing unease or bad dreams. Eventually, the musician locked the flute in a cabinet and refused to open it. His wife reported that the sadness lifted somewhat after that, though it never entirely disappeared. The man lived another 30 years, dying at a reasonable age, but something in him had been altered by his time with the instrument. He never played music again. The Anguille flute's current whereabouts are uncertain. It has passed through several private collections over the past 2 centuries, and its trail becomes difficult to follow after the mid-1900s. Some collectors believe it is still in France, held by a private owner who has chosen not to publicize its presence. Others suggest it may have been destroyed at some point, though no confirmed account of its destruction exists. What makes the Anguille flute compelling as a cursed object story is the specificity of its effect. It doesn't bring random misfortune. It brings grief. And it does so in a way that feels almost purposeful, as if the instrument is replaying the emotion of its creation over and over, passing the maker's devastation into every pair of hands that holds it. Whether that's a supernatural phenomenon or simply a very good story built around a piece of wood, it taps into something real about how we relate to objects and the emotions they seem to hold. We have all at some point held something that felt heavier than it should. A photograph, a letter, a ring. The Anguille flute is simply that feeling carried to its logical extreme. There are cursed objects that stay where you put them, and then there are cursed objects that refuse to stay anywhere. The Otterbein skull falls firmly into the second category. It is a human skull, or at least it was reported as one, that allegedly moved on its own, returned to locations after being removed, and generated enough unexplained activity in the homes of its owners that several of them attempted, repeatedly and unsuccessfully, to get rid of it. The story is strange even by the standards of cursed object legends, because the curse here isn't death or misfortune. It's persistence. The skull simply will not go away. The Otterbein skull takes its name from a small town in the Rhine region of Germany, where it reportedly surfaced in the early 19th century. The precise circumstances of its discovery are unclear. Some accounts say it was found during excavation work on a church or cemetery. Others suggest it was purchased at an estate sale, already separated from whatever burial site it had originally come from. What is consistent across versions is that the skull was unusual in some way that drew attention to it, though the nature of that unusualness varies. Some say it was abnormally large. Others say it was marked with symbols that no one could identify. The skull passed through a series of owners in the region over the course of several decades, and it was during this period that the stories of its strange behavior began to accumulate. The most common report was movement. Owners would place the skull on a shelf, in a cabinet, or in a specific location in their home, and later find it somewhere else entirely. Not in a different room, necessarily, though some accounts claim this as well. More often, the skull would simply be in a different position than it had been left in. Turned slightly, shifted forward on its shelf, moved to the edge of a table where it had previously been set back from the lip. These small movements are, of course, easily explained by vibration, settling, or simple misremembering on the part of the owner. A house on a road where carts and later vehicles pass regularly will vibrate enough to shift objects on shelves. A skull placed near the edge of a surface is more likely to be noticed in a slightly different position than one placed in the center. And human memory is notoriously unreliable when it comes to the precise positions of objects we interact with casually. But the stories grew more elaborate over time. One owner, a schoolteacher in a village near Otterbein, reported finding the skull in his bedroom on 3 separate occasions after placing it in his study and locking the door. He was alone in the house each time, and he could find no explanation for how the skull had moved. He began keeping a log of where he placed the skull each morning and where he found it each evening. The log, if it existed, has not survived to be examined by modern researchers, but the teacher reportedly showed it to neighbors and to a local priest, both of whom were sufficiently disturbed to suggest the skull be disposed of. The disposal attempts are perhaps the most interesting part of the Otterbein skull story, because they follow a pattern that appears in several cursed object legends. The owner tries to get rid of the object. The object, in some sense, refuses to stay gone. The teacher attempted to bury the skull in his garden. He found it on his doorstep the following morning. He attempted to throw it into a river. A fisherman downstream found it caught in his nets, and learning where it had come from, returned it to the teacher with a note expressing his discomfort with the object. The teacher eventually gave it to a neighbor who experienced similar unease and passed it along again. The skull circulated through the community in this way for years, each owner keeping it briefly before finding a way to pass it on. It became something of a local joke, though an uneasy one. Children dared each other to touch it. Adults spoke about it in lowered voices. The local priest blessed it, performed prayers over it, and suggested it be given a proper Christian burial. Whether this was done, and whether it made any difference, the accounts disagree. At some point in the late 19th or early 20th century, the skull left the Otterbein area and entered a wider market for curiosities and occult objects. It was sold, reportedly at a considerable price given its reputation, to a collector of unusual artifacts in another part of Germany. This collector, a man of some wealth and education, treated the skull as an interesting piece of folklore rather than a genuine supernatural threat. He displayed it in his study and monitored its position carefully, recording its location each day in a notebook. The collector's notebook, unlike the schoolteacher's log, does appear to have survived in some form, though its authenticity has been questioned. According to the entries, the skull did not move during the collector's ownership. It sat exactly where he placed it, day after day, without deviation. The collector concluded that the skull's reputation was entirely the product of suggestion and unreliable memory, and he said as much to anyone who asked. This is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because it raises the question that underlies every cursed object narrative. The skull behaved differently for different owners. For some, it moved. For others, it stayed put. The difference wasn't in the skull, it was in the people holding it. The schoolteacher, already anxious and primed to notice anything unusual, saw movement that the collector, calm and skeptical, did not. Both men were probably telling the truth about their experiences. They simply experienced the same object differently because they brought different expectations to it. The Otterbein skull's current location is unknown. It may still exist somewhere in a private collection, or it may have been lost, destroyed, or simply forgotten. What remains is the story, and the uncomfortable question it poses about the relationship between belief and experience. If you hold an object and expect it to move, will it? Not literally, perhaps, but will you notice things you wouldn't otherwise notice? Will you remember a position it was in and forget the one you actually left it in? The Otterbein skull suggests that the answer might be yes, and that the line between a cursed object and a perfectly ordinary one might have less to do with the object itself than with the mind that holds it. We end our journey through the world of cursed artifacts with an object that is, in many ways, the perfect cursed object for the modern age. It wasn't found in an ancient tomb or stolen from a sacred temple. It wasn't passed down through generations of aristocrats or hidden away in a private collection for centuries. It was sold on eBay in 2003 for $47, and within a few years, it had become one of the most famous haunted objects in the world, spawning books, a television series, and a Hollywood film. The Dybbuk box is a small wooden wine box, about the size of your two fists placed side by side, and according to every person who has owned it, it contains something that does not want to be contained. The box takes its name from Jewish folklore. A Dybbuk is a malevolent spirit, the soul of a dead person that has failed to move on to the afterlife, and instead attaches itself to a living person or object, causing harm and distress. The concept appears in Yiddish literature and in Jewish mystical traditions, and it has been dramatized in numerous plays and films, most famously in the 1925 Yiddish-language film of the same name. The idea that a physical object might serve as a container or prison for such a spirit is consistent with broader beliefs about binding spirits to material forms, beliefs that appear across dozens of cultures worldwide. The modern story of the Dybbuk box begins with a woman named Kultz. No, that's not right. The woman's name was Julia Chaikin, a Holocaust survivor who emigrated to the United States from Poland after World War II. Chaikin reportedly possessed the box, which she described as a family heirloom, though the box's age and provenance have never been independently verified. She kept it in her home for decades without apparent incident, treating it as a keepsake rather than an object of fear. When Chaikin died, the box passed to her grandson, a man named Kevin Mannies, who was an antique dealer based in Portland, Oregon. Mannies later claimed that Chaikin had given him the box shortly before her death, with specific instructions never to open it. Whether this account is accurate has been debated, but it established the first element of the curse narrative, a warning given and ignored. Mannies opened the box. Inside, he found a collection of small objects, 2 pennies from the 1920s, a small stone, a piece of hair bound with a rubber band, 2 small carved stones with Hebrew letters, and a small golden goblet. These items individually are unremarkable, but Mannies reported that from the moment he opened the box, strange things began happening in his home. Lights flickered and burned out. He and members of his family reported nightmares on the same nights. His mother, who visited and was given the box as a gift, suffered what she described as a stroke shortly after bringing it home, and she told Mannies afterward that the box was responsible. Mannies, shaken by these events, listed the box for sale on eBay. He included a detailed description of the strange occurrences, essentially advertising it as a haunted object. The listing attracted enormous attention. The box sold was returned by the buyer who claimed to have experienced similar phenomena, sold again, was returned again, and eventually was purchased by a man named Hammond Wilkins, a student who bought it out of curiosity and skepticism. Wilkins kept the box in his home for a period and reported his own experiences. The nightmares, the feeling of a presence, electronic devices malfunctioning, his dog refusing to come near the box. These accounts, combined with Mannies' original story and the accounts of the intermediate owners, created a chain of testimony that was difficult to dismiss entirely, even for skeptics. The box eventually came into the possession of a man named Adam Maddock, who passed it to Zach Mundy's. And from there, it entered a wider circulation among collectors and paranormal enthusiasts. Each new owner added their own account to the growing body of testimony. Some reported dramatic experiences. Others reported nothing at all. The variation in reported effects is itself significant and mirrors what we saw with the Otterbein skull. The box seemed to affect people differently, with those who expected something to happen more likely to experience something than those who did not. A Hollywood production company eventually acquired the box, and it became the basis for the 2012 horror film The Possession, which dramatized a fictionalized version of the box's story. The film was moderately successful at the box office and brought the Dybbuk box to a much wider audience than it would otherwise have reached. Whether the film itself constituted a kind of curse propagation, spreading the story and its associated anxiety to millions of people who had never heard of it before, is an interesting question to consider. The box has been studied by various self-appointed investigators, and in a few cases, by people with genuine academic credentials. None of these investigations have produced evidence of supernatural activity that would satisfy a scientific standard of proof. The objects inside the box are ordinary. The box itself is a simple piece of furniture, likely dating to the early 20th century based on its construction. There is nothing physically unusual about it. And yet the Dybbuk box remains one of the most talked about haunted objects in the world. It has generated more media coverage, more online discussion, and more genuine public fascination than almost any other cursed artifact on this list. Part of this is the power of the story itself, which has all the elements that make a cursed object narrative compelling. A warning ignored, a chain of suffering, an object that seems to resist being gotten rid of, and enough ambiguity that no one can definitively prove or disprove the curse. But there is something else at work as well. The Dybbuk box is a cursed object for the internet age. Its story was told online, spread online, and debated online. It was sold on a platform where anyone could buy it. And its reputation was built through the testimonies of ordinary people sharing their experiences in real time. It bypassed the traditional channels through which cursed object legends were created and spread. The whispered warnings, the newspaper sensationalism, the slow accumulation of folklore over generations. Instead, it became famous almost overnight, in the way that only something born on the internet can. This speed of transmission raises interesting questions about how cursed object legends work. In previous centuries, a story like the Dybbuk boxes might have taken decades to build a reputation, each new account adding slowly to the weight of the narrative. On the internet, the same story can reach millions of people in weeks. Each person who reads the story and then acquires the object brings their expectations with them, expectations shaped by everything they've already read. The curse, if there is one, might not be in the box at all. It might be in the story, spreading from mind to mind like a contagion, making each new owner more likely to experience exactly what the previous owners described. The Dybbuk box sits now in the collection of its current owner, who has chosen not to publicize its location. It is a small wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, containing a handful of unremarkable objects. It looks like nothing, and that perhaps is exactly what makes it so unsettling. We expect danger to announce itself. We expect cursed objects to look the part. Ancient, ornate, dripping with obvious menace. The Dybbuk box looks like something you might find in any antique shop, on any shelf, next to a stack of old books and a tarnished candlestick. It looks like nothing at all. And that is precisely why it terrifies people. Because if this box can be cursed, then anything can be. The ordinary coffee mug on your kitchen counter. The smooth stone in your jacket pocket. The small wooden box sitting quietly in the back of the drawer. Anything held by the right person, heard about by the right story, can become something more than what it is. Tonight, we've wandered through centuries and continents, from the mines of India to the ashes of a British living room, from the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs to a small wooden box sold on the internet for $47. We've met diamonds and dolls, paintings and skulls, murals and flutes, each one carrying its own weight of story and history and human fear. And along the way, we've turned over the same question again and again, from every angle we could find. Are these objects truly cursed, or are we the ones doing the cursing, projecting our anxieties onto the things we hold and the stories we tell about them? The honest answer, as it usually is with questions like this, is probably somewhere in the middle, in that quiet space where belief and reality overlap, and neither one is quite willing to let go of the other. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the haunted artifacts and objects of the world. If you're already drifting off, then our mission is complete. But if you're still awake, perhaps another deep dive through one of our previous episodes will carry you gently into slumber. Until we meet again in these quiet hours, may every object you hold feel light. May every story you hear bring you comfort rather than dread. And may you sleep knowing that the things that truly matter have no curse at all.